The envelope was crisp against my palm, sealed with the kind of precision Daniel always brought to financial matters. $20,000, he'd said. Final settlement. As if 47 years of motherhood could be reduced to a number, signed and sealed, done. I stood in the bank lobby, feeling the weight of it. Not the envelope itself, that weighed nothing, but the meaning, the finality he thought he was imposing, the control he believed he still held. "Mum, I know this might seem," he'd started to explain, his voice carrying that particular tone he used when he thought I wasn't understanding something. That patient, slightly condescending inflection I'd heard for decades. It's actually very generous. Market value of your contributions to the household over the years, adjusted for inflation. My accountant ran the numbers. I'd nodded, said nothing. Let him continue. This way everything's clean. No confusion later about who's owed what. He'd touched my shoulder, the gesture meant to be comforting, but feeling instead like possession. "I'll handle everything from here. You won't have to worry about any of it." Won't have to worry, as if worry was my primary emotion when it came to my own estate, my own life, the home George and I built together over 53 years of marriage. I'd accepted the envelope without argument, watched something like relief flicker across Daniel's face. He'd been prepared for resistance, I could tell, had his explanations ready, his justifications lined up like soldiers. But I'd simply tucked the envelope into my purse, thanked him for meeting me here, and watched him leave through the bank's glass doors. His shoulders relaxing as he walked toward his Mercedes. He thought he'd won something, consolidated something, tied up loose ends before they could become problems. He didn't know that I'd been here an hour earlier, that the estate planner whose office sat 3 floors above us had already witnessed my signature on documents Daniel would never see, that the power of attorney he'd held for 8 years, the one I'd signed when George first got sick, when I thought I needed help, when I believed family meant shared burden rather than opportunity, no longer existed in any legal sense that mattered. I found a bench near the fountain in the lobby and sat down. My legs weren't as steady as they used to be, though that had less to do with age than with what I'd just done. What I'd been doing actually for 3 months. Quietly, methodically, with the kind of deliberate precision George used to admire in me when I was younger, before I'd let that part of myself erode into constant accommodation. The folder in my bag, not the one with the envelope, but the other one, the thick one I'd been building for 6 years, pressed against my hip. Evidence, documentation. Every time Daniel had borrowed money that never got paid back, every time he'd helped himself to joint account funds for investments that never materialized, every time he'd assured me this was just temporary, just until his business turned around, just until the market recovered, just until I stopped being a person with needs and boundaries and became instead a resource to be managed, optimized, eventually liquidated. The fountain burbled beside me. The sound oddly peaceful considering what I'd just done. Considering what Daniel didn't yet know I'd done. The irony wasn't lost on me. He thought he was ahead, thought he'd orchestrated this moment, this transaction, this final assertion of control. But I'd been 3 steps ahead for months now, ever since the morning I'd gone to get groceries and discovered my debit card declined. Ever since I'd called the bank and learned that Daniel had transferred $48,000 to his business account. Our joint account, the one that was supposed to be for household expenses and emergencies. When I'd asked him about it, he'd said, "Mum, it's fine. It's an investment opportunity. You'll get it back with interest." I hadn't, obviously. That was 6 months ago. The declining card, the casual reassurance, the dawning realization that I had become, at 74 years old, invisible in my own financial life. But not anymore. I pulled out my phone, the new one Matthew had helped me set up last month, not the one Daniel had configured for my convenience, with himself listed as the account administrator, and sent a single text to my lawyer. "It's done. He doesn't suspect." Her reply came quickly, brilliant. "See you tomorrow at 2 p.m. to finalize the rest." The rest. The trust. The new will. The charitable foundation in George's name. The careful redistribution of assets that would leave Daniel with exactly what he'd always earned from me through genuine relationship, nothing, unless he chose to repair what he'd broken. And Matthew, my grandson, 26 years old, kind in the way his father had never managed to be. He'd get what he deserved, not because he'd asked for it, but because he'd never assumed it was owed. I tucked my phone away and stood up. My knees protested, but they held. The fountain continued its gentle music. Somewhere above me, in offices I'd just visited, documents existed that would change everything Daniel thought he knew about my future. His inheritance, the natural order of things. He'd given me an envelope with $20,000 and thought he was closing accounts. I'd given him nothing but silence and opened a door he didn't know existed. Fair trade, I thought. After 47 years of accommodation, a fair trade indeed. The drive home took 23 minutes. I counted. Not because I needed to know the precise duration, but because counting gave my mind something to do besides replay every interaction with Daniel from the past 8 years, cataloguing them into neat columns of before George died and after George died. Noting the subtle shifts in tone, the gradual assumption of authority, the way, "Let me help you, Mom," had morphed into, "I'll take care of it," and finally into, "You don't need to worry about the details." My house, George's house, our house, sat at the end of Maple Drive where it had sat for 49 years. Same blue shutters, though I'd had them repainted 3 years ago. Same maple tree in the front yard that had been a sapling when we moved in, now massive and dignified and shedding leaves across the lawn in gentle orange drifts. The lawn Daniel had stopped mowing 2 years ago, after George died, after he'd gotten busy with work. I'd hired a service, added it to the list of things I paid for myself that Daniel used to help with, back when helping meant relationship rather than transaction. I sat in the driveway for several minutes after turning off the engine. The house looked peaceful, solid, exactly like it always had. You wouldn't know, looking at it, that its ownership had just shifted in ways that would reshape 3 generations of inheritance. That inside, in a filing cabinet George had installed in 1983, documents existed that told a story Daniel had never wanted told, that I, until 6 months ago, had never wanted to tell. Inside, I made tea. Not because I wanted it particularly, but because the ritual helped. Kettle on the stove, I'd never switched to electric, despite Daniel's insistence that it was more efficient. George's favourite mug, the one with the chip on the rim that somehow made it more precious rather than less. The window over the sink looked out onto the backyard where George had planted tomatoes every spring until the cancer made it impossible to kneel in the dirt anymore. I'd maintained the garden alone last year. This year, I'd let it go wild. Weeds had reclaimed what George had cultivated. It hurt less than trying to maintain something I couldn't sustain, trying to keep alive a tradition that required 2 people, 2 sets of hands, 2 people who gave a damn about tomatoes and what they represented. The folder came out of my bag and onto the kitchen table. Thick manila, worn at the edges from being opened and closed, each time adding another piece of documentation to the story I'd been unconsciously building. I opened it now, let myself look. The first sheet, a loan agreement Daniel had written himself, dated September 2016. I, Daniel Morrison, hereby borrow $12,000 from my mother, Margaret Morrison, to be repaid with 3% interest by December 2016. Witnessed by George, back when George could still witness things, back when we both believed Daniel when he said his business just needed a small bridge loan to cover a temporary cash flow problem. December 2016 had come and gone. No repayment, no mention of it again actually until I'd brought it up 6 months later and Daniel had said, "Mum, come on, you're not seriously going to charge your own son interest, are you?" I hadn't. Of course I hadn't. What kind of mother charges her own son interest? The kind, I now understood, who wanted to preserve her own dignity. The kind who understood that boundaries weren't cruelty, they were architecture. The kind George had tried to encourage me to be before he died, before the cancer took the last 3 months and made him too tired to push back against Daniel's increasing involvement in helping Mum with finances. Page 2. Bank statement from joint account, April 2018. Withdrawal, $8,500. Memo, D. Morrison Business Expenses. No discussion beforehand, no request, just taken, like air or water or anything else assumed to be freely available. Page 3. Another loan agreement, this one for $6,000, February 29. For Jenny's college tuition, Daniel had said, referring to my granddaughter, his daughter. I'd given it gladly. Family helping family. That's what families did. Except Jenny had called me 3 months later, thanking me for the birthday check, and mentioned casually that her college was fully covered by scholarships and her part-time job. Dad must have misunderstood, I'd said. Must have. Jenny had agreed, but her tone suggested she hadn't misunderstood anything. The folder contained 23 separate instances, some large, most smaller, all documented, dated, preserved. Together they totaled $127,420, not counting the items that couldn't be documented with paper. The furniture from George's den that Daniel had removed to store and then sold, the silver service from my mother that had accidentally ended up in Daniel's dining room, the antique clock George had inherited from his father that now sat on Daniel's mantel like a trophy. I'd helped him every time. Written the checks, handed over the items, smiled through the explanations. Because that's what mothers did. That's what I'd been taught mothers did. Give until there's nothing left, and then keep giving from the deficit and call it love. But George had kept the receipts. Not to use against Daniel, I don't think, but because George kept receipts for everything. It was his nature, methodical, thorough. And after he died, when I'd started going through his files to understand what we owned and what we owed and how I'd survive alone, I'd found this. Evidence. Not gathered as weapon, but weapon nonetheless. The tea had gone cold. I hadn't taken a single sip. Outside, the sun was settling lower. The kitchen filled with that particular amber light that George used to say made everything look like it was dipped in honey. He'd take photographs this time of day, back when he did photography, back before the medications made his hands shake too much for the camera. I thought about Daniel's face in the bank lobby, the relief on it, the satisfaction. He'd thought this was done, solved. His difficult, aging mother taken care of, her finances consolidated under his capable authority, her inevitable decline managed in advance like any other business problem requiring preemptive action. He didn't know I'd already acted, that while he was drafting his final settlement and calculating fair market value for decades of motherhood, I'd been meeting with Marian Torres, the estate lawyer George and I had used to write our first will back in 1985, back when Daniel was 7, and we'd believed he'd grow into the kind of man who'd need inheriting from parents meant responsibility, not opportunity. Marian had listened to everything, had taken notes in her precise handwriting, had asked careful questions, had never once suggested I was overreacting or being paranoid or failing to understand how modern family finances worked. Instead, she'd said, "Margaret, you have options. Let me show you what they are." And I'd chosen them, all of them, quietly, methodically, with George's voice in my head, saying what he'd said 1,000 times during our marriage. "Measure twice, cut once, Maggie. Do it right the first time." I closed the folder, put it back in my bag. Tomorrow I'd bring it to Marion's office, add it to the legal file, make it official record in case Daniel ever challenged what I'd done. Evidence that this wasn't sudden or capricious or the confused action of an elderly woman losing her grip on reality. This was deliberate. This was chosen. This was the sound of a door closing on one way of being and opening on another. The house settled around me. Old house sounds, the furnace kicking on, the floors contracting as temperature dropped, the particular creak of the third step that George had never bothered to fix. I was alone. I'd been alone before, but this felt different. This felt like a choice I'd made, rather than a circumstance that had happened to me. It felt, I realized, like the first true breath I'd taken in years. Matthew called that evening. Not because it was unusual. He called every Tuesday, had done so for the past 3 years, ever since he'd moved to Portland for his job and established this routine of checking in with his grandmother. But tonight, his voice carried something different. Concern, maybe. Or perhaps I was hearing things differently now that I'd made my choices, now that the architecture of my life had shifted beneath me in ways no one else could see yet. "Grandma, just wanted to see how you're doing." His voice was warm, real. Nothing performative about it. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Made pot roast tonight." I hadn't. I'd eaten toast standing at the counter. But Matthew didn't need to carry my loneliness. That was mine to hold. "How's Dad?" he asked, and there it was, the careful navigation of loyalty. Matthew loved his father. I'd never wanted him to stop. But Matthew also saw things Daniel thought he'd hidden successfully. "Your father is well. Busy with work, you know." "Yeah." Pause. "He mentioned he was meeting with you today. Something about estate planning?" So Daniel had told him, or told him some version, the version Daniel believed was true, that he'd successfully consolidated control, tied up loose ends, managed his aging mother into graceful submission. We talked about finances, yes. I kept my voice neutral, easy. The same tone I'd used for decades when navigating the space between what was true and what people wanted to hear. Grandpa. Matthew's voice shifted, became careful. "If you ever need anything, if things feel complicated, you'd tell me, right?" My throat tightened. 26 years old, and he understood more than his 49-year-old father had learned in a lifetime. Understood that help meant asking, not assuming. That care meant checking, not controlling. "I would tell you. I said, and meant it. Matthew, you're a good man, learned from the best, he said quietly. Grandpa taught me what it meant to respect people. Really respect them, not just say the word. We talked for another 20 minutes about nothing important. His job, the Portland rain, whether I'd watched that show everyone kept recommending. Normal conversation, grandson and grandmother, Tuesday evening, checking in. But underneath it, I heard what Matthew couldn't quite say. I see what's happening. I don't know what to do about it. I wish Grandpa were here. I wished that too, every single day. After we hung up, I sat in George's chair. Not my chair, the floral armchair by the window where I usually read, but George's leather recliner, the one that still held the subtle indent of his shape, the particular worn spot on the right armrest where his hand had rested for thousands of evenings. While reading his paper or watching television or just sitting in comfortable silence with me nearby, I'd avoided this chair for 2 years. It felt like trespassing. Like sitting in it would somehow dishonor his memory or claim something that wasn't mine to claim. But tonight I sat, felt the old leather against my back, smelled the faint remnant of his cologne that somehow persisted despite the furniture cleaning I'd done 6 months after he died. Old Spice, classic, unchanging. The house was quiet, not empty quiet, different, chosen quiet, mine quiet. On the side table, beneath a stack of unread magazines, I found George's reading glasses. Black frames, thick lenses he'd needed the last 5 years. I picked them up, held them. They were just objects, plastic and glass and tiny screws, but they carried weight beyond their materials. They'd sat on George's face, had helped him see, had been the last things he'd touched before setting them down that final morning when he'd been too tired to read anymore, when the cancer had taken even that small pleasure. Daniel had asked if I wanted to donate them. Someone could use them, Mom. His prescription might match someone who can't afford glasses. But I'd kept them. Selfish, maybe, but mine to keep, mine to hold, mine to look at whenever I needed to remember that George had seen me, really seen me, had understood who I was beyond what I provided, beyond my function as wife or mother or grandmother, had encouraged me in those last clear days before the morphine made conversation impossible, to be strong, Maggie. Don't let anyone make you small. You're not small. You never were. I promised him I wouldn't, and then, after he died, I'd broken that promise. Let Daniel make decisions, signed papers without reading them, given and given and given because it was easier than confronting the reality that my son had become someone who took rather than someone who treasured. But 3 months ago, I'd started keeping the promise again, started saying no, first in small ways, then in larger ones. Started remembering that George had believed I was capable of strength, which meant I was capable of strength. which meant I could act on that capability. The glasses went back on the side table. The room darkened as evening deepened into night. I didn't turn on the lamps. Darkness felt appropriate, contemplative, a space to think without distraction. Tomorrow at 2:00 I'd meet with Marion. We'd finalise the trust documents, sign the new will, establish the charitable foundation. Every signature would be another step away from who I'd been, the accommodating mother, the easy mark, the woman who'd let her boundaries dissolve because she'd confused boundary setting with cruelty. And every signature would be a step toward who George had always believed I was, someone worthy of dignity, someone whose life had value beyond what it provided others, someone who deserved to choose, even when those choices cost something, even when they made people angry, even when they severed connections that had taken decades to build but only moments to poison. The phone stayed silent. Daniel didn't call, hadn't called in weeks actually, except to arrange meetings about my finances. We used to talk more before George died, before the power of attorney, before I became a problem to solve rather than a mother to know. I missed that Daniel, the one who used to call on Sundays just to talk, the one who'd asked my advice about his marriage, his career, his fears about being a good father. That Daniel had disappeared somewhere around 2018. Replaced by this efficient manager of inheritance, this consolidator of assets, this person who looked at his mother and saw a portfolio requiring optimization. Or maybe that Daniel had always been there, waiting, and George's death had simply removed the last obstacle to revealing himself. Either way, he was gone. And I was learning to grieve that loss while simultaneously protecting myself from the man who'd replaced him. The darkness filled the room completely now. Outside, streetlights flickered on. The maple tree cast shadows across the lawn. Everything looked the same as it always had. But everything had changed, was changing, would continue to change tomorrow at 2:00 when I signed papers that would legally sever the connections Daniel thought were permanent. I stood. My knees protested, they always did. After sitting too long in George's chair, the seat was deeper than mine, required different positioning. I made my way to the bedroom. Tomorrow would require rest, strength, clarity. Tonight required only acknowledgement. I'd crossed a line. There was no going back, and I didn't want to. Marion Torres had practiced law for 37 years. Her office reflected that tenure, walls lined with legal texts, framed degrees from Columbia, photographs of clients whose estates she'd managed, whose wills she'd executed, whose families she'd helped navigate the complicated terrain of inheritance and loss, and what remained after someone died. She'd handled George's estate, had walked me through probate with patience and clarity, explaining each step in language I could understand. never once making me feel stupid for not knowing the difference between executor and executrix, between real property and personal property, between the dozen other terms that had seemed designed to confuse grieving widows into simply nodding and trusting someone else to handle the details. Margaret. She stood when I entered, came around her desk to embrace me briefly. Professional warmth. Real warmth. Right on time. I'm always on time. It was true. George used to tease me about it. If something started at 2, I arrived at 1:55. Not early enough to be awkward, but never late enough to make anyone wait. We settled into the chairs by her window. Not the formal desk arrangement. This wasn't that kind of meeting. This was the kind where coffee appeared in real mugs, where the paralegal quietly closed the door, where Marion opened a thick folder and said, "Let's talk about what you want your legacy to look like." Legacy. The word felt heavy, important, like something that required capital letters. I brought the documentation you asked for. I handed her my folder, the thick one, the evidence. 23 instances of loans not repaid, transfers not discussed, promises not kept. Numbers that told a story numbers weren't supposed to tell. She reviewed it methodically, didn't gasp or exclaim or express shock, just made notes in margins, attached tabs, cross-referenced dates with the bank statements I'd printed, professional, thorough. After 20 minutes, she looked up. "This is comprehensive and useful. It establishes a pattern." "A pattern," I repeated. Clinical word, clean word, better than betrayal, I supposed, better than theft. Though looking at these numbers, at this accumulation of entitled assumption, those harsher words felt increasingly accurate. "Margaret, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." Marion set down her pen, leaned forward. "Are you doing this out of anger, or are you doing this out of protection?" I'd expected that question, had prepared for it. "Both," I said simply. "Can't it be both?" "It can," she said. "Should be, actually. Anger without protection is just reaction. Protection without anger is just repression. Both together is boundary setting, which is what we're doing here. We're, not you're, we're." As if she was on my side, as if I had a side worth being on. "The trust I'm proposing," she continued, pulling out new documents, "accomplishes several things. First, it removes all your major assets from individual ownership and places them in an irrevocable trust. That means Daniel can't contest it, can't claim you were unduly influenced or mentally incompetent. Once it's signed, it's permanent. Permanent." The words settled around me like weight, like relief. Second, it names Matthew as primary beneficiary upon your death, with specific provisions for his education, housing, healthcare, whatever he needs to build a stable life. "And Daniel?" I had to ask, had to know. Marion's expression remained neutral, professional. "Daniel receives the amount he gave you yesterday, $20,000. Exactly. No more, no less. It's what he valued your lifetime of support at, so it's what he receives. The symmetry was almost beautiful, almost funny, if anything about this situation could be funny. Third, Marion continued, we're establishing the George Morrison Memorial Fund for Elder Care. You've designated $500,000 as the initial endowment. That money will fund improvements to the Riverside Senior Centre, the facility you specified. New accessibility features, updated technology, staff training, all in George's name. 500,000. Half of what remained after George's death, after the house was paid off, after decades of careful saving and investing and living below our means so we'd have security in our later years. Daniel had thought all of that would eventually be his, had calculated it, I imagined, had run spreadsheets and projections and figured out how long I'd probably live and what percentage each year of my care would erode from his eventual inheritance, and whether expediting my decline into managed care would accelerate his access to those funds. Now it would go to strangers, to elderly people who needed grab bars in bathrooms and hearing assistive technology, and staff who were trained to treat them like humans rather than problems. It would go to purpose, to George's memory, to something that mattered more than one man's sense of entitlement. I want to do this, I said. All of it. Marion slid the papers across to me. Thick stack. Official seals. Language I only partly understood, but trusted her to have written correctly, to have structured in ways that would hold up under legal challenge, that would survive Daniel's inevitable anger. Read through each section, she said. I'll be right here to answer questions. I read slowly every page, every clause, every provision. Not because I expected to find errors, but because I needed to see it myself, needed to know what I was signing, what I was choosing, what I was permanently, irrevocably, legally making real. It took 40 minutes. Marion never rushed me, just sat quietly, refilling my coffee once, pointing out sections that required my specific attention. When I reached the final page, the signature lines, my hand trembled. Not from doubt, from magnitude. This was the moment, the turning, the point past which there was no returning to who I'd been, what I'd tolerated, how I'd let myself shrink to accommodate someone else's expansion. I signed. My name, Margaret Louise Morrison. The same signature I'd used for 74 years, but it felt different somehow, heavier, more real, as if the pen was cutting into the paper rather than simply marking it. Marion witnessed, added her signature, dated it, sealed it. Done, she said quietly. As of this moment, you're protected. Protected. Past tense. Already accomplished. No longer vulnerable. No longer exposed. No longer a resource to be extracted from until depletion. Thank you, I said, and meant it more than I'd meant most things I'd said in years. She walked me to the door, shook my hand formally, then hugged me less formally. "Margaret, what you've done today is hard. It might get harder before it gets easier, but you've chosen dignity. That matters." I drove home slowly, carefully. The documents sat in my passenger seat, secure in a sealed envelope that Marion said I should place in my personal safe. Evidence of choice, evidence of strength, evidence that somewhere between George's death and this moment, I'd remembered I was a person who deserved protection. The maple tree's shadow had shifted by the time I pulled into my driveway. Late afternoon light slanted through the branches, dappling the grass with patterns that shifted when the wind blew. Everything looked the same as this morning. Nothing was the same at all. Inside, I placed the envelope in the small safe George had installed in our bedroom closet. Locked it, spun the dial, felt the click of tumblers aligning, securing, protecting what mattered. Then I sat on the edge of the bed and cried. Not from sadness exactly, from release. From the sheer exhaustion of years of pretending I didn't notice what I noticed, didn't understand what I understood, didn't deserve what I absolutely, undeniably deserved. George's pillow still smelt faintly of him. I held it, let myself feel everything I'd been holding back, and then, after the tears stopped, after the shaking subsided, I stood up, washed my face, made tea, sat by the window and watched the light fade, and felt, for the first time in years, like I was allowed to exist in my own house, in my own life, on my own terms. It was only the beginning. Daniel would find out eventually. There would be anger, probably, accusations, attempts to undo what I'd done. But I'd chosen. And the choosing had changed me, had reminded me I was someone capable of choosing. That would have to be enough. Daniel showed up 3 days later. No warning, just a knock on the door at 10 in the morning, and there he was, hands in his pockets, expression caught somewhere between confused and irritated. "Mum, we need to talk." I let him in. No point delaying it. This conversation was inevitable the moment I'd signed those papers. He didn't sit, paced instead, the way he did when he was working himself up to something difficult. I got a call from the bank. They said the joint account has been closed. Yes, you closed it without telling me. I did. The simplicity seemed to throw him. He'd expected justifications, probably, apologies, the usual dance of explanation and reassurance. "Mum, that account was for household expenses, emergencies." "How are you going to manage your bills?" "I have my own checking account. I've had it for 49 years. But the joint account gave us flexibility, gave me a way to help if you needed anything." "Gave you access," I corrected quietly, "to my money." His face shifted, hardened. "That's not fair." "Isn't it?" I kept my voice level, measured. "Daniel, you withdrew $48,000 last November without asking, without even mentioning it. It was an investment. I told you about the investment. You told me it was temporary. You told me you'd pay it back. You told me a lot of things." We stood there, my son and I, in the living room where I'd raised him, where he'd learnt to walk and talk, and presumably learnt right from wrong. Somewhere between childhood and middle age, he'd unlearnt that last one. Or maybe he'd simply decided it didn't apply when the person being wronged was family, was mom, was someone who wouldn't fight back. "The power of attorney," he said finally. "You revoked it."
I did.
Why? Genuine confusion now, as if he couldn't understand why someone would want control of their own legal affairs, their own financial decisions, their own life. "Because I don't need managing, Daniel. I need respect." "I respect you." "No," I said gently, "you don't. You love me, maybe, but you don't respect me." He left. Not in a rage, that would have been easier somehow. Just left. Closed the door carefully behind him, got in his car and drove away. The house was quiet after, quieter than before, if that was possible. But it was my quiet, my choice, my house again. Later, cleaning out a drawer in George's desk, I found my old journal, the one I'd kept during those first years after Daniel's marriage fell apart, when he'd moved back home temporarily, when temporary had stretched to 18 months of him treating my space like his space, my food like his food, my tolerance like his right. Page after page of me writing myself into understanding why I should keep giving, keep accommodating, keep making myself smaller so he'd have room to be larger. "He's struggling," I'd written. "He needs support. That's what mothers do." But nowhere, not on a single page, had I written, "I need, I deserve, I matter." The journal went into the trash. Some histories didn't need preserving. The letter was in George's nightstand. I'd cleaned that drawer once already, months ago, but I'd missed the envelope tucked beneath the owner's manual for the adjustable bed frame he'd needed those last 6 weeks. Brown manila, unsealed, my name written across the front, in George's increasingly shaky handwriting. I sat on the bed to read it, hands trembling, heart doing something complicated in my chest. "Maggie, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you're probably trying to figure out how to manage without me, probably giving too much to Daniel because you think that's what good mothers do, probably not asking for help because you think that's weakness. Listen to me. You're not weak. You never were. Remember when we bought this house and everyone said we couldn't afford it? You made the budget work. You found ways. When I got laid off in '89, you kept us afloat. When my mother got sick, you cared for her like she was your own. You're capable. You're strong. You're smart enough to know when someone's taking advantage, and you're brave enough to stop it. Don't let Daniel make you small. I see him doing it. I see you letting him. I understand why. He's our son. You love him. You want to help. But help and enable aren't the same thing. You know that. I know you know that. Be the woman I married. The one who told the bank manager he was wrong about the interest rate and made him check twice. The one who organised the neighbourhood when they wanted to tear down the park. The one who never, not once in 50 years, let anyone tell her she was less than she was. I believe in you. I always have. Now you need to believe in you. Love, George. P.S. The money in the security box at First Federal is yours, not ours, yours. I set it aside because I knew you'd need resources Daniel doesn't know about. Use them for you, not for him, you. I read it 3 times, cried through all 3 readings. George had known, had seen what was happening, had tried, in the only way left to him, to give me permission to be strong. The security box. I'd forgotten about it. Or maybe I'd been avoiding it, not wanting to deal with one more thing, one more piece of George's careful planning. But now I needed to know, needed to see what he'd left me beyond the letter. First Federal Bank was downtown. The same bank where I'd met Daniel 3 days ago, where he'd handed me that envelope and thought he was solving something. The irony wasn't lost on me. The security box contained $42,000 in bonds, treasury bonds, carefully organised by date, each one marked with a sticky note in George's handwriting. For Maggie, emergency fund. Don't tell Daniel. Don't tell Daniel. As if George had known. As if he'd seen the future and tried to protect me from it. I sat in the small viewing room, bonds spread before me, George's letter in my hand, and felt something shift. Not just gratitude, something deeper. Permission. George had given me permission to protect myself, to choose myself, to understand that self-preservation wasn't selfishness, it was survival. That evening I wrote to Matthew. Long letter, handwritten on the good stationery I'd been saving for special occasions, finally understanding that choosing to write to my grandson was special occasion enough. Dear Matthew, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I want you to know some things your father may not tell you, may not want you to know. I wrote it all. The loans, the withdrawals, the pattern, the trust, why I'd made the choices I'd made, not to poison him against his father, but to give him truth, to let him understand that love and boundaries could coexist, that protecting yourself didn't mean you'd stopped caring. Your grandfather saw the best in everyone, but he also understood that seeing the best in someone doesn't mean ignoring the worst. He encouraged me at the end to be strong, to choose dignity. I'm trying, Matthew. I'm trying to honour that. You've been kind to me. You call. You ask how I am and wait for real answers. You treat me like a person, not a problem. That matters more than you know. The trust makes you primary beneficiary, not because I love your father less, but because I trust you more. Trust is earned over years, through actions that match words. You've earned it, he hasn't. Use the money wisely, build a life, maybe have kids someday and teach them what your grandfather taught you. That respect isn't optional, that kindness isn't weakness, that protecting people sometimes means letting them face consequences. I love you. I'm proud of you, and I'm grateful. Grandma, I sealed it, wrote for Matthew to be opened after my death on the outside, added it to the file Marion was keeping for me. The next day, I met Marion again. Final documents, the irrevocable part, the part that meant no going back even if I wanted to, which I didn't, but knowing the door would lock behind me felt important somehow. Financial audit came through, Marion said, sliding papers across her desk. Your total liquid assets, after accounting for Daniel's withdrawals and the trust establishment, come to approximately 1.2 million. 1.2 million. Despite everything Daniel had taken, despite the 48,000, despite all of it, George's careful planning, my own frugality, decades of living below our means and investing wisely and not spending just because we could, it had added up to more than enough. Enough to fund the George Morrison Memorial Fund, enough to secure Matthew's future, enough to prove that Daniel's withdrawals had been theft of opportunity, not necessity, had been greed, not need. I want to increase the memorial fund, I said. Make it 750,000. Can we do that? Marion smiled, actually smiled. We can absolutely do that. The Riverside Centre will be able to do extraordinary things with that endowment. Really extraordinary. 750,000 to elder care, to people who needed support, to a building that would bear George's name and help people who'd been invisible the way I'd been invisible. Daniel would inherit 20,000. Matthew would inherit the rest. The symmetry was perfect, the justice complete. I signed the final papers. Marion witnessed, her paralegal notarized. It was done. Completely, irrevocably, permanently done. How do you feel? Marion asked as I prepared to leave. Free, I said, and meant it. The Riverside Senior Centre occupied a converted warehouse on the east side of town. The kind of building that had probably manufactured something important decades ago before manufacturing left. And the building sat empty for years until someone with vision saw possibility in exposed brick and high ceilings and natural light. Helen Reeves, the director, met me in the lobby. 70-ish herself, silver hair cropped short, eyes that had seen too many budget cuts and too many residents going without. Mrs. Morrison. She shook my hand firmly, professional, but underneath I saw hope. Thank you for coming. She led me through the facility, showed me what $750,000 could do, would do actually once the renovation began next month. Accessible bathrooms, updated therapy equipment, a new community room where residents could gather without worrying about the roof leaking or the heating failing or any of the dozen other infrastructure problems that came from trying to run a dignified operation on a charity budget. "This wing here," Helen said, stopping by a wall where architectural plans hung. "This will be the George Morrison Activities Centre. Art therapy, music therapy, a library, computer lab for residents to connect with family." She glanced at me. "Your husband was a reader, you mentioned." "Every evening, right up until he couldn't hold the book anymore. Then he would have loved this." She pointed to the library design. Floor-to-ceiling windows, comfortable chairs, space designed for humans, not just function. I touched the architectural rendering, traced the words George Morrison Activities Centre with one finger, George's name on a wall, helping people, mattering beyond the span of one life. "He would have," I said quietly. "He absolutely would have." My phone buzzed. "Matthew." I excused myself, stepped into the hallway. "Grandma." His voice was tight, careful. "Dad called me. He's trying to challenge the trust. I know he would." I'd expected it. Marion had expected it. We'd structured everything specifically to withstand challenge. His lawyer told him it's ironclad, that he has no standing, that once you signed those documents, they became permanent. Matthew paused. "He's really angry, Grandma. He said some things. About you. About your mental state. About me influencing you. Are you okay?" Not asking if he believed it, knowing he didn't. Just asking if he was okay with being blamed. "I'm fine. I just wanted you to know." "He's sending you a letter. Through me." "He said he won't come to your house anymore, won't call you. But he wanted you to have his final thoughts." The quote marks were audible. "Bring it by," I said, "when you're ready." 3 days later, Matthew appeared at my door. He looked tired. Caught between loyalty and reality, the hardest place for a kind person to be. The envelope was thin, single page probably. I took it without opening it. "Come in." I made coffee. We sat in the kitchen. He didn't mention the letter. Neither did I. Instead, we talked about his work, about Portland, about whether he'd come visit for Christmas. Normal conversation. Grandson and grandmother, coffee and cookies, afternoon light through the window. After he left, I opened the letter. It said what I expected: accusations of manipulation, claims of mental incompetence, threats of legal action he couldn't actually pursue, words designed to wound, to make me question myself, to pull me back into the dynamic where his anger controlled my behavior. I read it once. Then I walked to the living room and placed it under George's reading glasses. The glasses he'd never use again. The glasses that had helped him see, let the weight of them hold down Daniel's words. Let George's vision literally press against Daniel's rage. The letter stayed there, under the glasses, where it belonged. 2 weeks later, Helen called. "Mrs. Morrison? Construction started today. Would you like to come see?" I drove over immediately. The building was chaos. Workers everywhere, protective tarps, the sound of demolition and reconstruction happening simultaneously. But there, in the lobby, a new sign hung temporarily. Future site of the George Morrison Activities Centre. Future site. It wasn't finished. Wouldn't be finished for months, but it was happening. George's name. My choice. Real impact in real time. Helen found me standing there, staring at the sign. "The residents are excited," she said, "when they heard about the renovation, about what it means for their care, for their dignity. I've never seen morale this high." "Their dignity? My money? George's money? Our money? The money we'd earned through decades of work and careful choices would fund other people's dignity, would create space where elderly people weren't invisible, weren't burdens, weren't problems requiring management, would do what Daniel had never understood needed doing, treat aging humans like humans. I cried standing there in that chaotic lobby, hard hat-wearing workers moving around me, Helen's hand on my shoulder. Cried because George would have been proud. Cried because I was proud. Cried because I'd made a choice that mattered, that would outlive me, that would carry George's memory forward in ways that honoured who he'd actually been rather than who people wanted him to have been. "Thank you," Helen said, "for seeing us, for caring enough to make this happen." "Thank you," I replied, "for giving me somewhere to put the love." Because that's what this was, love. Not transactional, not obligatory, not extracted through guilt or manipulation. Just love, given freely to people who'd use it to build something good, the way love was supposed to work. The envelope to Matthew sat on my kitchen table, sealed and ready. Inside, everything I hadn't said in the first letter. Not instructions or warnings or justifications, just truth, just love. Matthew, this second letter is different. It's not about your father or the trust or any of that. It's about you. You've been the grandson I needed without ever knowing you were needed. You called on Tuesdays. You asked real questions and waited for real answers. You treated me like someone whose thoughts mattered, whose life had value beyond function. That's rarer than you know. Your grandfather loved you. He saw who you were becoming. The kind of man who understands that kindness isn't weakness, that respect isn't optional. He'd be proud. I'm proud. Use the inheritance wisely, not carefully, you don't need my caution, but wisely. Build something that matters. Love someone who deserves it. Become the kind of person whose absence would be felt, not for what you provided, but for who you were. And if someday your father reaches out, If he tries to repair what he broke, forgive him if you can. But remember, forgiveness doesn't require restoration. You can forgive someone and still protect yourself. You can love someone from a distance that keeps you safe. I learned that late. You can learn it now. Grandma, I sealed it, placed it with the other documents Marion was keeping, instructions to deliver it when I died, along with the trust papers. The evidence folder, everything that told the true story rather than the comfortable one. The house was quiet, late afternoon. The maple tree's shadow stretched across the lawn, reaching toward the window where I sat with my tea. Real tea this time. Hot, slow, mine. If you're reading this, and I suspect you might be if you've gotten this far, then maybe you recognize something. Maybe you've been the accommodating one, the giver, the one who shrinks so others can expand, the one who's been told that boundaries are selfish, that protecting yourself means you've stopped loving. Let me tell you what I learned at 74, though I wish I'd learned it at 24. You're not a resource, you're a person. Your needs matter as much as anyone's. Your dignity isn't negotiable. Your peace isn't something you owe to anyone's convenience. Saying no isn't cruelty, it's architecture. It's building a space where you can exist without constantly bracing against someone else's demands. The people who love you, really love you, will respect your boundaries. The ones who don't weren't loving you, they were using you. There's a difference. Learn to see it. I'm old now, old enough to know that legacies aren't what you leave behind in wills and trusts. They're what you leave in people, in the way you taught them to see themselves, to value themselves, to protect themselves. Matthew got the money, but he already had the legacy. George gave it to him. Respect, kindness without assumption, the understanding that other people aren't objects, they're humans deserving of dignity. Daniel got $20,000, exactly what he valued me at. Perfect symmetry, perfect justice, not revenge. I don't have energy for revenge. Just boundaries, just consequence. Just the natural result of choosing to take rather than choosing to treasure. The George Morrison Activities Centre will open next spring, his name on a building, helping people, making dignity possible for those who've been made invisible. That matters more than inheritance, more than blood, more than obligation. I finish my tea. The light shifts. Evening comes. The house settles into its familiar sounds. The furnace, the floors, the particular creak of boards George never fixed. I'm alone. But I'm not lonely. There's a difference. I learned that too. The envelope to Matthew sits on the table. My story told true. My choices made clear. My life reclaimed. Tomorrow I'll deliver it to Marion. Add it to the pile of documents that prove I existed, that I mattered, that I chose. But tonight I sit in my house, George's house, our house, my house, and feel something I haven't felt in years. Peace. Not happiness, not joy. Those might come later, or they might not. But peace, the quiet kind, the earned kind, the kind that comes from knowing you protected yourself, chose yourself, remembered you were someone worth protecting. The maple tree outside loses another leaf. It drifts down, lands on the grass, becomes part of the earth. I watch it fall, and I breathe.